So you're saying my father and his kingdom?
Well, yes. It's based on the fusion of a Sumerian god named PHAR and a Mesopotamian god named Wei.
And we're in a toy train.
Yes. It's enough to really make you question all of existence, isn't it? So what do you think you're going to do about it?
I'm gonna do what I've always done. I want to get the out of here. Father of omens, give me blood beyond sight. Hey, what the?
On this recording, I thought I'd talk briefly about leadership and following as categorical constructs, and I became uncomfortable with being at that point. I was a drummer and a Bible study teacher in my mid-teens. At my old church, and I understood the feeling of being between a rock and a hard place, in the sense of you have certain responsibilities to keep to in terms of the content that you're teaching, but there are things that aren't necessary, don't necessarily have to be said all the time as well, like ending every session with for this book is the perfect word of God, disobey any idea in it and you'll burn in hell. So I could meet the stipulations of the criteria of teaching a Bible study session without being a fundamentalist, or without because it was a learning experience for me too, just to have the responsibility. And that's why it was really Shakespearean, "To thine own self be true." That was also said to me during the years of the church experience. And so once I could no longer feel at peace with my own conscience, for instance. This happens. There can have been and are priests overseas who have realized that they don't believe. They can't afford to believe anymore, and meet either online in chat rooms, or they're deconvert ministered, quotes, to by Dan Barker, who got some notoriety for his initial book, Losing Faith in Faith, from preacher to atheist. But what I find to be inappropriate is that religious people are, in my opinion, obtaining and accepting bad answers as legitimate answers, so much so that in numerous ways their language affects them to the point that it doesn't really can occur to them that to think of the framing of questions or wrong questions. It can also be the workforce. Anyone can tell you that over time, loyalty to a superior, an employer, a boss, if they say, "Luke, can you go and take in this prescription from John and Jane Doe?" they're not asking me to, and I'm standing, and obviously not already involved in the task. That rules out that they're asking me because they want me to possibly say no, having been already preoccupied with a task. So the question's equivocal to an order. I couldn't say, no, I'm not going to take in John and Jane Doe's prescription because I'm having an introspective existential crisis from thinking about nothingness and whether I'm an idea to everyone, or whether you're all ideas to me, and whether there's no escaping this paradigm, so, but as far as bad questions goes, when you say things like I've said, like that art is the only form of spirituality that's left, it then gets critics from the religious right will like to, and it's nothing new in that it's borne out in the way that the religious right have contested art to begin with, in terms of saying that song lyrics are promoting certain ideas, when really artists have plenty of contentions with producers and record labels, unless the producer is Dr. Dre, who's fucking awesome, unless he's having problems with his producers he's had to deal with. But yeah, I think if the response, if your stance is I stand back and decline or abstain from, or I fail to honestly or sincerely subscribe to any sort of religious following, and the word following now has, thanks to social media, a more trivial kind of that connotation. You can follow someone in Twitter, and it's not quite the same as in league with the disciples following a messianic figure. But so when the religious right go, well, if you don't want to follow God, then, or if you don't want to serve, or if Yahweh, who's a God whose name, as Rick and Morty were addressing cleverly, was Yahweh, made up of a fusion of two gods, a Sumerian god named Yah and a Mesopotamian god named Wei, and they fused the name together into Yahweh. And that's why you'll see different creation narratives in Genesis. Chapter 1 and chapter 2, it goes back to God's creating the heavens and the earth. The two contradictory accounts of the similar topic is recurrent and replete, particularly in the Old Testament, and that's because the Yahweh himself, as a god, was taught to us as one god, but came together through the fusion of cultures, polytheistic gods, into one conceptual god, at the expense of various additional contradictions. Then the a priori contradictions innate to the concept of an all-knowing, all-powerful itself. But take while I didn't learn about drugs until getting taught as part of my capital chemist experience, be back. Yeah, to talk about someone as a fan of art and an art lover or appreciator as or an artist as led by or following, or there's a lot of terms like, this person was your idol, Billy Idol was your idol. I thought Idol was his last name. No, and there's the invocation of terms that are made without a second thought and judgments that really don't apply unless religious discrimination has been applied as these judgments have been made. And it's insulting because the love of independent thought is I would say amongst the majority of motivational forces that compel and inspire a deconversion from a religious group. Mistreatment, misjudgment, mistreatment is there too. Essentially, empty promises on this or that religious institution's gatekeeping of the truth and then learning that can't possibly be the case and then that disappointment can be a force of propulsion away from a religious organization. But art was always a liberating experience, an escape away from religion. And so that doesn't mean that these artists were were gods. It's insulting because the part of your contentions with the church is these concepts in the first place. It's why should I believe a God exists? Not I have no problems disputing the existence of Billy Idol. I just don't. And if I was his greatest fan, I wouldn't idolize him. I'm not particular. Rebel Yell and White Wedding, two songs I admire, but so yeah, I don't think art's equivocal. Art's the first thing to be mistreated by what religions try to do, because they get a bit snide in that they tell us all something that we definitely know isn't true, which is that you need God's existence to know the moral life. Which is, and they'll go, and then they'll to either implicitly imply or explicitly say that without believing in God's existence and accepting God's moral teachings, you don't know how to be moral at all. And that's a contradiction profoundly against the practice of deducing and thinking about moral aspects and facets to works of art. It's just that there's so much more to art than that component. There's aesthetics, there's beauty, there's storyline, there's characters, there's character backstories, character conflicts and struggles, and victories and defeats, and there's relationships, there's individualism, there's cooperation in spite of differences, there's so much more dynamics in artworks that, yeah. But if you've been a kid that's had any sort of nursery rhymes or kids' stories read to them, and then you're asked at the end, and that's the other part that's, Socratic artists don't hesitate to leave out of the way that they'll describe art, categorically speaking, which is when, at the end of being read a story, you're asked, well, what do you think the moral of this story is? And then you say from the Little Red Hen, well, unless I help gather the flour and bake the bread, then I perhaps don't deserve to sit down and eat the bread. Or more generic, generalized, unless I'm contributing something, how can you expect returns without making any sort of investment to begin with? But yeah, the idea of being so what I'm saying is artists and artworks I don't think should or to be regarded, and I was careful to use the word spiritual, which is a reiteration of recitement of Marilyn Manson's, one of Marilyn Manson's 90s quotes, that art is he said, I think art is the only thing spiritual that's left. And this makes a better acknowledgement of the appropriation, the appropriateness of his historical context, given considerations, for instance, of the veracity of supernatural claims in ancient doctrine. Now, if things known now to us, I mean, Sam Harris says, is there anything you read written in the Bible that could not have been written by someone in the Iron Age, Bronze Age? No, not really. And however, we can't say that in the Bronze Age and Iron Age they had Nintendo and Google. So I don't think our generation has, particularly amongst the educated, as much grounds to feign claims of veracity to miracles. Whereas where I think that, and there's an overlap here with tested pharmaceuticals, is that often certain drugs will have a success rate as high as 30% in the placebo sample, which is when a body of a group of people gathered together and they trial a substance intended ultimately for pharmaceutical use. Then they're testing for response. They're testing for a reaction, a noticeable reaction, and effectivity to the substance. In doing so in the past, they've often discovered that the actual effect was, by most people, not what they expected from that drug. One would be gabapentin for epilepsy, and then pregabalin is made, and both acting on the GABA regions of the brain. They were originally looking for another epilepsy treatment, and then discovered that pregabalin was quite good at nerve pain. So, like physical pain in nerves. Another one is what goes by the trade brand mark Zyban, which is a prescription pill to help with quitting smoking. Now, it was originally on trial as a prescription antidepressant. So when they were getting feedback from their first trials, they just noticed, and I'm quite sure that as part of controlling these tests, there's no interaction on the basis of discussing the effectiveness of these, or the effects of these substances between individuals in a trial. But people were saying, well, while I'm still quite depressed, what I've noticed is I'm smoking a lot less. So Zyban winds up going on the market to treat and help quit smoking. The placebo effect is essentially, you might say it's the imagination working more than the medicine, which in the event of being given a placebo, you've been given an inactive substance that's can't possibly do anything in terms of therapeutics. It's not a drug. It would be like powder pressed into a shape of a Panadol tablet and scored as a Panadol tablet, and then but yeah, so this does show the imagination to be powerful. And yeah, time as it's passed has exhausted a lot of, of the three Abrahamic faith traditions left, the Abrahamics as I call them, as a DJ, none of them have a problem with 997 other gods having their religions exhausted and obliterated. There are small groups of, I think, more people now on Earth than comprise the Flat Earth Society are graduates from going to university to study courses in how to speak fluent Klingon, which is a language invented as part of the Star Trek franchise, the natural language of the Klingon alien race. So you can actually go and do a degree in learning to speak Klingon. So obviously many fans have. I've related to the idea of an alien. It's interesting because I'm someone who Bowie was well established before I discovered any of his works. The Labyrinth, not so much being quite the first. I went back up after getting a best of Bowie CD and DVD. And while not containing all of his clips, it contained a great many clips. Like I don't think you can even see full versions and proper versions of clips to the Heart's Filthy Lesson or Little Wonder or 7 Years in Tibet on YouTube to this day. But yeah, they are brilliant clips. Now, related to, and I don't want to get into turning on the waterworks or appealing to sympathy ties or empathy ties when conversations are more desirable. I mean, particularly in a recording for public address is intended by this for my YouTube channel. I also have this complaint against the religious, is that if there's any moments in your past or childhood where blood's been shed, it seems, and psych will do the same. Like a psychiatrist won't begin his line of questioning with how are things at work and how you've been treated at work. He'll go, what was your childhood like? And in my case, I get to age 5 and they're ready to prescribe every drug in the safe. But I hadn't finished my conversation, and I hadn't even approached the particular problems that were catalytic of me going to see a psychiatrist. So no, saying I mean, Marilyn Manson is not even... Some fans that I don't think were really listening to what... and if these were pro-Satanists, but by that time in the 90s, the Church of Satan had even gravitated away from existential claims concerning the character of Lucifer, which would have them as like a church theologically opposed to the mainline Abrahamic faith churches, because they would have an opponent of the deity being worshipped and having this cultic following, in very much the same way that you can say Christians aren't all that different. But where I'm at and have been at for quite some time, and what Manson's made particularly clear is that devil worship has been something that the Church of Satan itself has had distance from, to the point of being more or less atheistic. Worshipping yourself, ideas like worshipping the self sounds maybe too egotistical. However, if mistreated by a religion, misjudged by religious people, then that sort of phraseology is not all that overwhelming or intense, particularly if it's a recovery that you're working at. So yes, the Church of Satan admits of being just archetypal in dealing with the concept or the word Satan by its etymological roots, meaning the opponent or adversary, which would just be like a debate partner, really. You could, in fact, in a two-person debate, each of them would be calling the other Satan, potentially. But yeah, the confusion between what'll happen is that if you just if you show that you've got your own well justified, perhaps better justified than the majority of religious debates, use of a word like God or Lucifer or Satan or or worship or whatever, it's the religious who will first jump and say, well, then that's who, you know, or they'll say, you know, Manson singing a cover of Johnny Cash's "God's Gonna Cut You Down" is because Marilyn Manson's now, you know, a, a Vatican Pope and has repented from being the Antichrist. But Antichrist Superstar and the song in the 90s should have given fans some idea that Jesus, the humanity of Jesus, wasn't under any contest by Marilyn Manson even then. When approached by critical journalists, in a protestive tone, how can you be against a God who loves you so much? How can you be against Jesus? I couldn't possibly be against Jesus because your religion killed him and what he stood for. And that's more sincere treatment of the texts on Jesus than the texts themselves, really. That the Jesus Christ is a concept. It's got elements of, sadly, and it's why I prefer to think of him. I appreciate his life. I don't appreciate his death. I don't appreciate bribe money put out for kidnap and ransom, kidnap, uphill suicide, rapey murder. I call it rapey murder, as I said, because in Adam and Eve narrative, you have them hiding their shame with realizing they're nude and hiding their shame with leaves. And so, yeah, the mockery intended for Jesus, as they were calling him the King of the Jews, and then crucifying him, is symbolized by that crown of thorns being put on his head. So that's to shame him. So adding a loincloth to shame him, to hide his shame, wouldn't be shaming him. So to add the loincloth would suggest to remove the crown of thorns. Yeah. Now, so yeah, so now go back to art, disciples, so there's some appreciation to the artistic reinvention of terms. There's sub-debates about whether dictionaries should have considered these conceptual contingencies to begin with, or should be making room for modified definitions. Definitions can change over time with usage. So a disciple of bands like Marilyn Manson and Korn aren't equivocal to disciples of the Christian church. You know, these singers aren't regarded as deity. Granted, like humility, I learned. I in fact would argue I learned a better appreciation for the story of Jesus than I had ever learnt myself in church from Marilyn's interviews, his writings. But you know, to be an antichrist opposed to the murder of Jesus. Well, if you've got forged gospels and manuscripts that are the trust in which you can place is shonky at best, and but the most agreed upon fact concerning the claim and case for the historicity of Jesus, that he existed as a historical figure, is the event of the crucifixion. So if you step back and go, well, this crucifixion I don't think was just, so I have no way to appreciate it, much less give thanks for it, much less ceremonially eat it. So and I'm also tired of the religious person's type of help or type of thinking that without asking you directly to your person face what's wrong, they make things worse by assuming what's wrong on your behalf, and anything that does go wrong they don't think could ever have anything to do with them, their church, their agenda, their propaganda. Instead, it's got to do with any time blood was spilled within your family and your, after this, therefore, because of this, as the Latins say, which is the fallacy of thinking that an event after another event in time has a direct effect. Now, when you've got, I have an opinion that the death of Jesus, though they try to argue for this hybrid existence of him as a man and yet also supernatural, God, whether that be God incarnate or the Messiah and God incarnate and a man at the same time while on earth, so that, as Michael Shermer sums it up, you try to make sense of that story, and it's God sacrifices himself, kills him. He sacrifices himself to save all of planet Earth from himself. So if this argument, if this concept wasn't wielded by and I don't necessarily blame the scribes, because they were, I think, historically dictated to by, much like you see in Blackadder, where he'd have Baldric, I think, writing things out, and Blackadder would be just pacing back and forwards with his hands behind his back because Blackadder was in that season too important to be one to scribe. Additionally, until the invention of the printing press, if only the upper class and privileged and rich had access to literature, because it had to, any book you wanted had to be hand copied by a scribe. But yeah, if interviews make it apparent that Manson's no fan of the killing of Jesus, if that's quite apparent in the lyrics to Antichrist Superstar, if that's furthermore elaborated on in interviews and then discussed furthermore at various times of other journalist interviews, lyrical content from a different angle, as is with the album Mechanical Animals, and then again in Hollywood, the album Hollywood, it was clear that what a part of the idea that Marilyn wanted to challenge us to think about was by no means, it was the furthest thing from a conversion to Christianity Freemasons are closer to being Christians than Antichrist. You know, so my take on it is, yeah, you can, and then these people become believers not only in a version of and a brand of Christianity that is really quite offensive and insulting to everybody, saying everybody's inbred, and Jesus' death was to get rid of the problem of a woman eating an apple, but preserve that sanctity and keep that sanctity intact of being inbred and loving being inbred. I do not think that's why this man died. I do not think he died for my or your sins. In the reflecting God, I would sense vitriol concerning mislabeling for the reasons for the death of Jesus, the value attached to his killing, that it was for yours or my salvation, yours or my forgiveness. When you're in the bridge, you hear that chanting, no salvation, no forgiveness. No. Something my former bosses would do would be to take lines like that out of lyrics and go, well, so you don't believe forgiveness is even possible ever? You know, and that's the sort of way they think, and that's why religious discrimination shouldn't apply to art. While I understand where a whole lot of confusions begin, it doesn't excuse their mistake, particularly when their final, what I say without reserve, is a final solution approach to the world by means of religious problem solving. And what that means is that essentially for any person in the world, they'll find ways to make problems out of I mean, you could do so with Dr. Seuss and the Cat in the Hat. You could say, you know, cats, this is very confusing. Ancient Egyptians, it's quite clear from their stone buildings that they humbly admired the cat, but now they're domesticated pets, and quite frankly, making them wear hats is well, it's to confuse the young children, you know. Here it's Australia. There's a hole in the ozone layer. Wearing sunscreen is very important. There's climate change issues. It's got to, young people should be wearing hats, but let's not make them think that domesticated pet cats need to be in hats as well. Or you could say, well, how dare you not put a hat on your cat while you're putting sunscreen on you? Are you some kind of cruelty to animals activist that's psychotic? Have injections from the capital chemist owners for the rest of your life. $1,000 a month injections. So yeah, art doesn't. Let's take, for instance, the album "Follow the Leader" by Korn. So its title, and this is what I don't like the approach being, they frame the issue going, oh well, what is it we see what you're promoting, we read this and read what you're promoting, and I think a lot of that comes out of the fact that when they consult their own religious doctrine, it's hated what the religious doctrine's promoting. This can be the case with mums who are against what their kids in their teens are enjoying out of rock, even though they'll admit that when they were young, their parents didn't enjoy them watching Elvis gyrate his hips on stage. But they'll watch that, you know, listening to Elvis is not a millennial's cup of tea. But yeah, songs on the album follow the leader, such as "Freak on a Leash," even by the title of that song. But you go to the lyrics, and it's about being led in a fucked up way, I suppose. It's not about promoting, or Jonathan Davis, Korn's frontman, calling himself the leader for all to follow. Nor is the song "Got the Life." You know, God told me I've already got the life. Oh, I say, if anything, that's chipping away at, and the title "Follow the Leader" is a sarcasm. Were it not the content of the album thematically is more serious than sarcasm, than to call it. Nonetheless, religious make these sorts of errors in judgment.